I sort of peeked around the corner into the foyer, weapon in hand, and saw him sitting on the floor with a rifle across his lap, a cardboard box, and army webbing that turned out to be Vietnam War era. And his first words to me were, and excuse the language, but put the gun down or I'll blow the whole fucking place up. So then I went, handed my gun to the uniform guy, which I'd vowed and declared I'd never do, but I did. Took a step in and then demanded to know who I was, showed him a badge, and then he said, "Why don't you come and talk to me?" And for whatever reason, I have no idea why I did. That's exactly what I did. I walked up and started just talking with him. As I got closer, I saw in the box it turned out to be 15 sticks of gelignite, TNT, with 3 electronic detonators wired up to a 12-volt battery. All that was needed was to touch the terminal wires to the battery. The whole place would have gone up.
Okay, joining me on the freedompact podcast today, I have Keith Banks. And normally I'll read out a little introduction for the guest, but in terms of my guest today, he has such a long career, such an impressive career, so many things going on, that for the first time ever, I'm going to be a bit of a lazy podcaster here and ask you, Keith, to please, if you can, give us a little elevator pitch of your career. I know it's quite an extensive career, so it may be hard to answer this one in quite a short space. But yeah, man, let us know. Give us a little elevator pitch of Keith Banks.
Sure. Okay. 20 years compressed into 30 seconds. I joined the police at the age of 17 as a cadet. Did 2 years in the academy under that cadet system. Walked the beat, the classic, wore the uniform for a couple of years. Just before I turned 22, I volunteered for deep undercover work in the drug world. So I went deep undercover for almost 2 years under an assumed identity, or in fact I think I had about 4 assumed identities. And my job was to infiltrate drug networks and buy predominantly heroin, but certainly other drugs that were prevalent then. And we can get into the whole heroin thing later, I'm sure. 2 years of that, I came out with a whole disrespect for authority, an adrenaline urge that I needed to fill, because working undercover alone, deep cover, there's no backup. It's not like the movies. So, I started questioning everything. And in a paramilitary organisation, it's probably not the best thing. So my urge for adrenaline saw me volunteer for or apply for the tactical operations area, which is akin to, well, it is the armed defender unit that you have in the UK. Mm-hmm. Not sure what the terminology is, but our role was to execute high risk jobs, raids, etc. All trained by the SAS, heavily armed and so on. I was in that team for probably 8 years. I was involved in a gun battle in 1987 where one of my people, one of my team, one of my friends was killed, and another one badly wounded. And I just fell into a heap of trauma-related PTSD. Not that I knew about it. No one knew about it in those days. A few years later, I'd moved out of tactical into back as a normal detective sergeant. One afternoon, I was out and about and responded to a siege in the centre of the city, which was comprised of a Vietnam veteran with a box full of gelignite, a hand grenade, and a rifle, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But I was basically a magnet for trouble, I suppose, and all through that, I was battling what I understand now as PTSD. So I was broken, and I resigned from the police force to take up a corporate role, and then spent 30 years in various corporate roles. Wow. Wrote a couple of books a few years ago, which were published, still much to my amazement, and that's propelled me now to talk, present, mentor, support in the mental health space, and particularly the PTSD space. And most recently, an ill-fated venture into a reality program.
Of course.
So here we are.
Wow, amazing. I mean, I think that we could do an hour-long podcast on any 1 year of your career. There's so much to talk about there, and that little introduction. But I want to start at the beginning. And so Before you went into this line of work, before you joined the police, do you think that you had any sort of traits or attributes or an aptitude for this line of work? And if so, what are they? And what aptitude and traits are there that make a good undercover cop?
I've reflected on this a lot, and I grew up in a pretty bad environment of domestic abuse, both physical and mental. Um, and having unpacked a lot of what I've gone through in therapy over the last 5 years, I've realised, on my psychiatry, my psych and I have realised that in a childhood where you walk on eggshells to avoid being hit, or abused, not sexually, but certainly emotionally, gives you an ability to blend in with an environment. So I spent my days at home trying not to anger a stepfather who had a fondness for alcohol, and the fondness for alcohol resulted in wife beating and certainly my beating of me. So from that time, I became very conscious of my surroundings. I became very conscious of how to act and what to say. And they're traits that helped me later in an undercover world, particularly when people recognised me or they were suspicious of who I was. So I joined the police force for two reasons. One is an escape from that environment. And the second, I was fueled by a desire to work in an occupation to protect people from bullies. Doesn't take a shriek to figure out how I got to that mindset. But I had intended to go to the cops and spend 2 years in the academy, maybe 2 years working on the road, do a part-time law degree at university, because where I'd come from, we were quite poor. And in those days, I think we had started paying for uni degrees. So that was my plan. And within 12 months, I loved being a cop and loved positively affecting things so much and locking up the bad guys. I discounted that whole legal career pretty quickly.
Wow. Tell me about and I know if there are any Australian listeners right now, they might know a little bit of this background, but for our international audience, tell me a little bit about Terence John Clark and how his doings influenced your career.
Absolutely, great question. Terence John Clark was a New Zealander. He was the architect of what was referred to later as the Mr. Asia Syndicate. But Terence John Clark was the architect of a massive amount of heroin that flooded into the country started around the late 70s. Border control was minimal. There was certainly a lot of corruption in both the customs area and throughout police forces in Australia at that time as well. Clark single-handedly caused thousands of deaths by overdose of heroin. Heroin became the drug of choice, really, not so much in a lower socioeconomic area, but middle class. Middle class kids were using heroin frequently and in great numbers. And because of the quantity of heroin that Clark was bringing in directly from the opium suppliers in Asia, the percentage was huge, or the percentage of heroin versus mix was huge, and people were literally dying in toilet stalls, in alleyways, and sometimes on the street. It was a terrible time, and I realised after, I think I had about 2 years service, maybe three, almost 3 years service, that there was an undercover section in the drug world, and I. I still had the youthful knight on a white charger view of the world. So I thought the way to do something definitive about fighting the heroin trade was to work undercover. So that's why I volunteered and went through a quick interview process, and a couple of months later, there I was.
Now, in terms of when you moved into undercover work, now I've spoken on this program to quite modern CIA spies who've told me all these tests and all this deep training they had to do to work undercover. For you back then, was it like that, or was it more, here's your equipment, get on with the job?
Yeah, number two. There were no psychological tests. There was no screening. It was really Wild West stuff. And because I was a baby-faced little guy, and shorter than the average, 6 foot tall cop in those days. I was never. No one ever thought that I looked like a cop. No one ever thought I was a cop, and I did a lot of things purposely off duty, not to have those mannerisms anyway. Don't know why, So my interview was, I think it took maybe half an hour with the officer in charge of the drug squad, and then he rang me at home the next day to say, yeah, look, we think you'd be okay. Take some leave, grow your hair, come back into the office, and you can start in I think it was 6 or 8 weeks or something. So I walked into the office, so snuck my way in, and again, one of those bizarre things, undercovers every now and then had to go into police headquarters to the drug squad office, which you'd think is at odds with being deep undercover. But anyway, so walked in. I was paired up pretty quickly with an existing undercover guy to hang around with him for 3 or 4 weeks and watch how he dealt and watch how he made buys, and then I was on my own. Sink or swim.
Half an hour, man. Half an hour into that's quicker than an interview to get a job at a fast food chain these days. That's
as I said, man. It was the 80s and it was pretty Wild West.
Wow. So you're in the job. You have the position. Do you remember your first day on the job, or your first sort of few weeks, months, or your first big job? Do you remember what that looked like?
Yeah, the first time. Now it's probably important to backtrack a little. I'd never drunk alcohol. I didn't smoke cigarettes. I'd certainly never used drugs. The alcohol thing was, seeing a domestic violence environment, I vowed and declared I'd never drink. So I think in the first week, I met an informant or an informer in a pub who was working with us, and I can't talk about nowadays and methodology, etc. And what I do know I won't talk about, of course. But in those days, informers worked for us either to get rid of their opposition or purely for reward. So informers would introduce us to drug dealers in a network. We'd then work our way through, buy larger amounts of drugs, and work our way up the chain. So my very first time I met an informer, and I'd never worked with him, I was still a very naive, non-street smart kid, and I walked into the bar to meet this guy, this man mountain, and I said, "So, g'day, I'm Keith," and he went, "Yeah, I could pick you a mile away." And he turned to the bartender and said, "2 beers," and I said, "I don't drink," and he said, "Well, you do now." Okay. So I had a couple of beers with him, and a minor drug dealer he'd arranged to meet, and I just bought, I think, a bag or two of weed from him, just to really test it all out, I guess, to see whether I could actually seal a deal. And I was making all this up as I went along. That was my first big drug buy, was 2 bags of pot, and then I was half drunk and driving in a car after I'd been drinking, all the things that were wrong in my black and white world. And I very quickly fell into that whole lifestyle of just being my assumed identity and my cover was I was a mid-range drug dealer.
And this eventually, obviously, and we'll get to talk about this later on, but this snowballs into some much more serious drug buys. But at this point, when you're green, you're wet behind the ears in the job, did you have any level of imposter syndrome at all, thinking, what am I doing here? Am I cut out for this? Was there any imposter syndrome creeping in?
Oh, absolutely. It was there from day one because I'd not been trained. I'd seen another undercover deal with dealers. I'd seen him make some buys, but it was all Greek to me. I was just trying to figure it out. And yeah, absolutely. I thought, my God, I've got no idea what I'm doing. How am I going to be good at this? Because I wanted to be good at everything I did. And I wanted to make a difference. And I just, for that first probably couple of months, I was rethinking my decision most days. Yeah. And it wasn't until I started to get a little experience and just a bit more street smarts that I realised, I could be pretty good at this stuff.
And just in terms of the skills that you need to be good in this job, I'm thinking right away, if I'm looking at undercover cops, I'd want them to be acting, trained in acting, trained in the art of influence, trained in the art of negotiation. What skills make a good undercover cop?
The first of all, it's maintaining that very thin line between who you are portraying and who you actually are.
Mm.
So you've got to retain your identity. You've got to remember who you are at the core of your being, because it's very easy when you're living in a criminal world unsupervised to teeter over that edge. Very easy, and in fact, some of my friends did it.
Wow.
So that's the first thing. Just moral compass, man. You just got to remember that you're one of the good guys. The second thing is absolutely learn to lie effectively and very quickly, and have the facial expression to accompany the lie. So um, we talk about it with each other and compare it to so NIDA, the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Australia, is where all the aspiring actors go to. And we just joked about the fact that what we were learning on the road as we were doing it was NIDA on steroids. And and I often say now, an actor gets a bad review, he or she get their feelings hurt. If we actually got a bad review, it'd be a baseball bat around the head or worse. So you've really got to understand the whole acting component and get into character. Become the person, but don't quite become the person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and then always have an excuse in the back of your mind. If you're walking into a place and someone calls you by your real name, have an excuse ready to go. If someone recognizes you, and it happened a few times, have an excuse ready to go. Um, Always have a plan B, even when things are proceeding smoothly. And all of that, you have to have the outward appearance of someone who's there to do drug business.
When you think about all the jobs in your career, what comes to mind when I ask you about a time where you've come the closest to having your cover blown in a dangerous situation?
I was only talking to someone about this yesterday, who asked me a similar question, and it would have been, God, because I'd finished Undercover. I went back into the drug squad as a junior detective, and then I was shanghaied back into an undercover role because by that time I'd gotten pretty good at it. So I was in far north Queensland with an undercover colleague this time. I was supposed to be controlling, meaning taking charge of the exhibits, doing all the paperwork, giving him strategies, and Larry was completely burned out by then. He'd been under for about 5 years, and he just couldn't do it alone. So I just started working with him. So one particular night, we'd been working our way through a list of targeted drug dealers in the area. Again, I was focused on heroin and powders, not so much cannabis. But we met a guy who spoke to us about doing £100 deal of cannabis, and it's impossible to walk away from that because that in those days, and probably still is now, that was pretty high level. We had no idea about the background of this guy. We didn't have computer systems in those days. If you wanted to do a check on someone, you rang from a public phone booth with a pocket full of 20-cent pieces. Long before mobile phones, kids. Scary, isn't it? So we had no idea of his background, and we're in a bar or a disco one night, and I muscled up to the bar, and he was beside me, and I ordered 3 drinks. I'd gone to school in this particular place in far north Queensland, but I'd left in year 9, so we're talking, good grief, I don't know, 7 or 8 years later. I'd grown a beard, I had long hair, and I thought I was unrecognisable. The bartender turned around, took one, looked at me, and called me by my first name, my real name. I said, "Is that Keith? Is that you?"
Oh.
I was using an assumed name, and so again, you're always, by that stage, I was pretty switched on. Always having the back of your mind a plan B. So I just threw some pretty bad language his way and threatened to leave the bar and punch him in the throat unless he gave us our drinks, and I don't know who the hell he was talking about, blah blah blah. But I turned and looked at this guy. And if ever you've seen photographs of Charles Manson, the Sharon Tate murders, his soulless black eyes, this guy looked at me in the same way, and it still sends chills down my spine now. And he looked at me and said, "He called you Keith," just in that tone. And so I brushed it off. Went back in the next, and I went back into the bar the next day and spoke to my old school friend and told him exactly what I was doing, and said, "Look, we've got to really fix this up." So back in that night, he gave us free drinks, fawned all over us, pretended that he didn't know me. He was apologetic, and this criminal loved it. At the end of the operation, what we discovered was that his name was Alan Thomas Davis. The name he'd been giving me was Tony. Tony was planning to kill me for the money that I was putting up for the £100 cannabis deal. He'd escaped from a prison in South Australia for a double murder. He'd been on the run for maybe 3 years. And his murder, he and another colleague kidnapped 2 gold prospectors in the Northern Territory in Australia, tortured them with a knife for over 4 hours, and then just turned them down and shot them in the back of the head. He was a psychopath. And that was even though I didn't know his background, I knew there was something about him. Yeah. And that was pretty risky. I don't know what he would have done. I suspect he would have probably brought his murder intentions forward somewhat if he'd realised we were cops. He didn't care. So there were some others where I've been recognised, driving along the street by cops. You would think who were a little bit more sensible, but they'd see me and go, and point or wave. Best way to deal with that, if you're in a car with a drug dealer and a cop waves at you, you just lean across and backhand him in the face, because clearly they were waving at him. Mm. Yeah. I was in another beer garden one night, a pretty notorious pub, setting up a drug deal, and it was packed to the rafters. It was full of criminals, drug dealers, outlaw motorcycle gang members, etc. And the guy that I was buying from leaned across the table and said he'd checked my number plates on my car and they were false plates, and I must be a cop. And we carried guns as well in those days. We had little tiny 25 caliber semi-automatics that weren't police weapons, and I had it in my boot. There's no way I could have gotten to it, and I thought I would get, at the very least, badly injured. So I just went on the offensive and yelled at him and accused him of working for the feds or the cops, the fact that he could check number plates. And it was like out of a Western movie. The whole beer garden just went quiet, including the guy playing guitar in the corner. And and then I just thought that best form of defense is attack. So leaned across the table, shoved my finger at him, threatened to punch him, and then forced my way out. And by the time I got to my car to put my key in the ignition, my hands were shaking so badly with adrenaline, it took me probably 2 or 3 minutes to be able to calm down enough to get in the car. Came back a couple of days later to his house and had a conversation with him, and he was incredibly apologetic because I'd reacted the way that a normal drug dealer would, not tried to, take another path, I guess. So that's the life of an undercover cop, or it was. Things are different these days, but in those days, we were just by ourselves and you had to live on your wits.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's extremely impressive. If that is just off intuition and no training, that's just what felt natural to do in the moment? Yeah,
it did, yeah. And when I say no, we didn't have any formal training at all, but the other undercovers, when they weren't deployed out of the city on jobs, we'd actually tend to hang together. So we taught each other. We'd tell each other our stories. We'd tell each other what we'd done and how we overcame them. So we had our own little. It was 2 things, mate. It was an informal support network, because no one really gave a toss about our welfare. Our own little support network and our own informal training network.
Now, for someone who sworn they were never going to touch alcohol, how did you end up being in a situation where you were forced to do a line of speed?
Yeah, it's a big leap from alcohol to speed. And again, it was one of those things. I met a guy in the same pub I've just mentioned, the one with the notorious beer garden, and we were talking about drugs. And I spent like 2 years of my life meeting people talking about drugs, and he offered to sell me some speed as a sample in a place in Brisbane, which is now a multi-million-dollar area. Pretty ordinary, maybe some squats in the day, etc. So I arranged to meet him at his place that night. And again, it's important to reinforce, we had no surveillance tailing us. We just did what we did. No one would have known where we were, certainly not in this case. And I turned up to his house, and as soon as he answered the door, I looked at him and he was speeding. He was off his head. And I thought, ooh, this is not good. But rather than walk away, no self-respecting drug dealer would, I walked in to buy, I think I wanted 4 grams of speed as a sample, or 5 or something. And so, he went away, got them, came back, exchanged the money. And then he said, okay, we'll do a line. And I had, by that time, I'd had my story straight. Anytime the offer of powder came up, my immediate response was, don't do the shit, man, I'm in for the money. 98% of the time that worked. People are going, wow, love that. That's what I'm like. This is where we make our money. We go and live in the Greek islands. Not this guy. He said, you're going to do a line with me. And I said, I just told you I don't use it. He reached under the table and produced a double-barrel shotgun that was sawn off, maybe 18 inches for the barrel. Yeah, just a classic little crook's weapon. Put it on the table, cocked both hammers back and said, if you don't do a line with me, I'm going to blow your chest open. And I looked at him and said, okay, where's the straw? so my very first line of speed, and it was horrible. So I did a line with him. Okay, he was happy. Maybe he was testing me. Maybe he just wanted someone to party with. Don't know. But I drove back to where I was living. I'd never had any form of drugs in my life. And suddenly I was speeding for probably 8 hours. And the come down the next morning was horrible. When I reported to my detective sergeant contact, told him what had happened, because you still need to keep evidence, chain of evidence. You still need to keep notes of things and running sheets. There's still all that cop stuff to do. So I went into the office, handed it all over, again, snuck my way in through the back and skulked through the corridors like a mangy dog, and just said, okay, this is what happened. Pulled a gun on me, etc. He went, oh, yeah, okay, we'll make a note in the running sheet that he's got a gun. Okay, off you go. So no support, no questioning. And I think there was a mentality in those days that everyone expected undercovers to be drug users.
Yeah.
Never formally said, but certainly informally condoned. Yeah, it was pretty challenging.
That is crazy, man. There's no way something like that would stand up today.
No, God, no, man. Can you imagine the welfare, the civil suits, the legal liability? And it just came down to, and I often reflect on it, and it came down to certain detectives who were quite prepared to regard undercovers as collateral damage, use them, and then kick them to the curb later because it benefited their careers to have big drug arrests on their records.
Now, this is a question I never truly want to know the answer to, but I'm going to ask you to give me your best self-assessment. What does it feel like to have a gun put in your mouth?
Well, then when I did that myself, when I sat at home and put a gun in my mouth. Or are you talking about another? Sorry, because it's happened.
I was talking about another one, but
you were talking about another one. Yeah, we'll talk about my stuff later. That was when I was in Townsville. That was when I was first. I think it was my first job out of Brisbane, and I was with an undercover colleague and shadowing him and watching him. We used our own cars in those days, so hence the false number plates. And my car had to go into a mechanic for some road repairs. I damaged a shock absorber or something, I think, and cleaned out all the weaponry that we had. And we carried a lot of guns in those days because everybody had one. Even your average law-abiding person would have a high-powered rifle in the house. There was no licensing requirement. You could simply go to a sports store or go to a department store like a Kmart, if you have them over there, and buy a high-powered rifle or a shotgun. So before I put it into the mechanic, I cleaned out everything out of the boot. So I think we had a shotgun, we had a couple of shotguns, a couple of pistols, some ammunition, and so on. So what I thought I'd done was clean it all out, but I left a box of ammunition under the spare tyre. So it turned out that because we looked pretty rough, again, the beards, the long hair, and we just cultivated the look of bad guys, he rang the local police. So they came looking for us. And there I was, minding my own business, standing on a balcony in this nice little unit we'd hired or we rented. And suddenly there's banging. I saw 2 police cars pull up. About 6 detectives run towards the stairwell. And I said to my colleague, geez, the cops are doing a raid. Wow, I think they're coming up here. Banging on the door, I opened the door and the first guy through did exactly that, grabbed me by the throat and put his 38 revolver in my mouth. As you would if you were taking down who you thought was just, pretty tough, potentially armed robbers or bad guys. So to answer your question in a short way, very metallic and quite scary. um,
Yeah. When
then
you
he
no,
he
please.
followed it up. He followed it up with some, as he called it, interviewing me around the head. So pulled the gun out, smacked me around a bit, and then it became apparent very quickly after that who we were.
One thing I've always wondered when hearing stories about undercover cops, undercover spies, when it's time to turn these guys in, when it is time to finally put them away, is it ever hard? Does it ever feel hard because you've spent so much time with these people? I imagine in some instances, albeit fake, you've forged some sort of deep connection by that point.
Yeah, it is. The trouble, there's a couple of things with working undercover. Whilst you keep in the back of your mind who you are and why you're there, you're not human if you don't form connections with people. And some of the guys, and I say guys because there were some women as well, but some of the guys that I dealt with, I actually quite liked. I quite liked their company. They had my sense of humour. Some of them were with partners. They were loyal to their partners. Then I was dealing with some cops who cheated on their wives constantly, drank while they were on duty, stole money from drug dealers. Some of them, not all of them, and just worked. And they were just personalities I didn't really gel with and didn't want to gel with. And here I was in the drug world dealing with people, buying drugs from them, knowing I was going to send them to jail, whose company I quite preferred. And there was one guy in particular on an operation. I really liked him, and he kept offering me cannabis, and I was buying a lot of heroin, and I kept saying no. And finally, he came to me and said, "Look, man, I really want to help you out. I've got 500 Buddha sticks direct from Thailand," and I thought I can't say no to that. So bought the drugs. When the operation was over, everybody is charged with supply to an undercover agent on particular days, dates, times, and so on. So our cover, it's another thing, our cover was always blown at the end of an operation. So we'd be sent from one end of Queensland to another, and Queensland's a pretty big state. But so he was arrested and interviewed, and he asked to speak to me in an informal way. So I walked into the interview room and he said, "Oh, mate," he said, "now I get it. So I just want to say it was really nice to meet you, and I think you're a good guy." That was tough.
Yeah.
Because I knew he was going away for probably 2 years. And I had done everything I could to protect him from that. So, on the other hand, though, there are some people that you meet and you buy drugs from who are horrible individuals, psychopathic, sociopathic, and you're more than happy to see them go away for 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, you've certainly tangled with some very evil people in your career, man, and most notably, arguably most notably, there's so many crazy stories in your book, and I encourage people to go and check them out. And there's so many good stories, but one of the biggest ones I'd like to, if we could run through today, is that infamous story in 1987. You were the leader of a tactical weapons team who forced entry into the house of, was it Queensland's #1 most wanted at the time?
Yeah, he was. Queensland's #1 most wanted. He was an armed robber and a vicious man. So the role, as I touched on before, was tactical operations as special weapons, Americanized SWAT, UK armed defenders, as I said, I thought SA-19 or something. And in Australia, there are varying names now. But the mission is the same, and the mission is to execute high-risk raids. And we were armed with submachine guns. We were trained. We had access to tear gas and distraction grenades and so on. And we were only called when the situation was dire. We'd executed hundreds and hundreds of raids in a similar fashion and not fired a shot. No one wants to be in a gun battle. No one wants to shoot anybody, but we were trained to do it if we needed to. And the element of it was surprise. We'd always go in nice and hard and fast. And and I wrote about in I think my second book the one job we did where we had two teams. One went through the first floor and the other went through the ground floor. And our methodology was so quick that there was a target cleaning his teeth in front of the mirror in the bathroom. And before he knew it, he was grabbed, he was tussled down the stairs, cable tied, and sitting against the wall, still with his toothbrush in his mouth. It still makes me chuckle to think about it today. Just this whole what the hell happened look. So we'd done hundreds of jobs. This one we knew was probably the worst potential or the most potential to end up in gunfire, because the target had been on the run. He'd escaped from a jail, I think 7 or 8 years before. One of the high non-escape, one of the escape-proof quotation marks jails in Australia, and he got out. So he'd been committing armed robberies for that time. He had shot and killed one person and badly wounded another in 2 separate armed robberies, just because he wanted to, not because he had to. His method of operation was he'd race into a bank, leap on the counter. In those days, there was no bullet-resistant or bulletproof glass. It was all open counters. Fire shots into the air, terrorise people, steal and go. He had been tackled by a bystander about a week before we became involved, when he raced out of a bank. And the target was only, I think he was about 5'7", so he wasn't a big guy. He was tackled by a bystander. They wrestled over the money. Very brave guy. Wrestled over the money, and the target got away with his high-powered rifle and left the money behind. And we became involved. He was living in a house with a woman and her 2 children, and they had a part-time nanny, house sitter, lady in her late 60s who was there just to look after the kids, clean the house. She knew what he was. She knew that he was a bad man, but in that great Australian spirit, thought, nah, I won't dob anybody in, not my business. Until he started screaming at the television when they broadcast an interview with the bystander who tackled him. And unfortunately, they used this guy's name and the suburb that he lived in. Very, very, very easy to find someone through open source information, even in those days, very easy. So he was screaming at the television about how he was going to find this guy and kill him. The housekeeper had a crisis of conscience, went to a detective that she knew through an extended network, I guess, and told him what was happening. So surveillance was put on the house, and we were activated. So we started planning the job. We spoke to the surveillance guys. We looked at photos. We had a particular methodology in place that had been taught to us by the SAS in their counter-terrorist role. So everything was clicking in. The problem we had was that I had just completed an SAS course, or a course with the SAS in Western Australia, a counter-terrorist instructors course. So I knew exactly what I was doing. So I put together what's called an operation order, and part of that operation order was the use of tear gas and stun grenades or flashbangs. The permission to use those wasn't granted by someone in higher authority, and I suspect because he just didn't know what the hell flashbangs were, or distraction grenades as they were in the order. And rather than ask the question, he just gave a blanket no. He also refused to authorise tear gas because of the presence of 2 children in the house. Again, not understanding that gas delivery would have been limited to where the target was in a particular bedroom. So those normal tools that we had and we relied on to assist the element of surprise were gone. And then to compound things, my mate Peter, who was another full-time member with me, and we're only, I think our full-time was maybe 8 to 10 guys, the rest were all part-time. Peter was also the equipment officer, and he'd put in an urgent request to have our ballistic vests updated, because the vests we were issued with were only suitable to stop shotgun or pistol fire, if that. And ironically, as we were laying out equipment before we went into this house, he was laying all the current vest on a table, and one of the investigating detectives said, well, that's stop a rifle, mate. And he said, God, no, it'll go through it like a hot knife through butter. So fast forward, we'd rehearsed, we had briefed, we'd done everything we could to prepare. We'd looked at following the guy out of his house and taking him out in a public place. That meant risk to civilians because he would have absolutely fired at us. We discounted that for that reason. We discounted taking him out in a vehicle intercept for the same reason. We discounted surrounding the house and calling on him to come out because he had 3 ready-made hostages. Even though he was in a relationship with a woman, he wouldn't have hesitated to hurt her or the children. So we were left with the age-old smash the door down and go in at the early hours of the morning. So without the cover of gas and the use of stun grenades, the only thing I could do was to come up with a distraction team at the front of the house under his bedroom window, so about maybe 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters. And I said to the guys, we will try to enter covertly. If we have to smash the door, you need to throw a ladder through the window to distract his attention. All of that happened. And as we were smashing our way in through the door, I heard 2 distinct rifle shots. He was so hyper vigilant. As soon as he heard the noise and then the ladder came through the window, he leapt out of bed and fired 2 shots directly through the skirting board of the floor, where you would expect 3 guys to be clambering up a ladder. So we went inside and it was on. He started shooting at us pretty quickly. Peter was the first through the bedroom door. He was hit 4 times in the torso, once in the wrist. And you have to imagine this is pitch black, no lights on. Our torches were mini mag lights, so quite small torch, like pencil torches. So ambient light was not there because winter in Queensland is pitch black. So black room, flashes of gunfire, screams, and so on. And Pete was hit, the rounds picked him up and pushed him back into the corner of his bedroom. The second guy in was knocked over by the impact of that. The third guy was my best friend in the world. He and I lived together. We'd worked together. He was shot in the lower stomach under his vest, and the round picked him up and pushed him back into the hallway. And then 2 of us started engaging the offender and went in and killed him. Peter died 2 hours later. But before the ambulance arrived, I was in the corner stripping off his vest and trying to give him as much first aid as possible. But he was, as I said, he was hit 4 times in the torso. Prophetic. The rounds had gone through his vest like a hot knife through butter. And that was the worst day of my life. That sent me on a downhill spiral for probably 3 decades into a very dark, sad, joyless PTSD life. Yeah. It's still tricky to talk about, even all these years later. Because I can still see him and hear him screaming with pain. It was horrible, just horrible.
Well, I really appreciate you revisiting that story. I know it can't be easy, so I really do appreciate you going over that. Did you suffer survivor guilt?
Yeah. I didn't know what was happening with me. I'd never heard of PTSD. I knew that I was having an emotional reaction. I started drinking heavily every day. I couldn't sleep. I had flashbacks. I had hypervigilance. Man, I'd check the windows and doors 6 times a night before I went to bed. Probably, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the operation, we were told that there was a contract on our head. So the 2 of us had killed the offender. That there was organised crime money coming from Sydney interstate. Can't remember how much. It might have been 20 or 30 grand or something to find us and kill us. So we were given authority to carry our sidearms off duty, which was quite unusual. But that was it. There was no security check of the house. There was no surveillance. There was nothing. It was just, okay, guys, you need to start carrying your guns. And then, which leads me to what I spoke about before. I remember sitting in my house, always had my firearm with me, and I was drinking every night. I'd get pissed every night so I could sleep, wake up in the morning, go to work, run 5, 8Ks, go to the range when I could finally start going to the range again, because it took me a while to get used to pulling a trigger, squeezing a trigger, and then just, go to work and come home and do the whole thing again. And my partner at the time worked in advertising, so she was out at a function And I was sitting at home playing The Green Fields of France by the Furies over and over and over. Just a song that stuck in my head. I'd heard an SAS operator sing it a cappella when I was on the course. But it's such a sad song. And I was playing it over and over and over and over. And just, whew, and I reflect on that night and think, man, I was just lost. And as I sat there, I was thinking about Peter, thinking about the gun battle, because I thought about it every minute of every day. And I looked at my weapon. So it was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Chambered around, so it means I pulled the slide back. So there was a round, the hammer was back, safety catch was off. And I just put it in my mouth and thought, if I just squeeze this trigger, it all goes away. And then I'll know what he knows, is there something else? And as I was sitting there, I had a flashback to a suicide I'd gone to some years before as a young cop. And a guy had killed himself with a 303 rifle, sort of World War I vintage rifle, and it completely removed the top of his head, and it was, brain spatter and blood and whatever all over the wall. And I thought, if I do that, Kathleen will come home and she'll see the same sort of thing, which would traumatize her forever. So I didn't think about not killing myself for any other reason than it would affect her. And then when I realized what the hell I was doing, I took it out of my mouth, I unloaded it, I stripped the frame and the slide and hid them around the house, and then went to bed and pretended to go to sleep. So when she came home, and I woke up the next morning and thought, I'm in big trouble. I'm in really big trouble, but I don't know what to do about it. We had no counselling in those days. You certainly wouldn't have spoken to anybody else in the tactical team to say, I had a gun in my mouth last night, man, I came close to killing myself, because I would have been removed immediately and correctly. We're all alpha males. The culture in those days was suck it up, never show weakness. And so I just went through, another 2 years of that before I decided to leave and going back into the covert world. But then it continued. So I realise now it was survivor guilt. Yeah, I it's a classic, and I have a lot of friends in the Army or the Defence Force veteran community say the same thing. Why me? Or why not me? Why him? Coulda, woulda, shoulda. Maybe I should have pushed back more, and I blame myself completely for it. And ironically, all these years later, when my former colleagues now are able to talk to each other openly, we all blamed ourselves for it.
Yeah.
So all of that collective trauma was suffered individually, and it was just a horrible, horrible place to be in.
Man, I'm so sorry that you guys didn't have that option for help or any sort of coping mechanism for this. It's crazy to think of a world, man. I mean, where that's the reality. And what point did you finally get help with all this?
I left the police force in 95, went into the corporate world, and I had a major anxiety collapse 11 years later. No catalyst. Bang. It all just fell on me. Everything. And so I started seeing a counsellor literally that night. She told me I was a critical mass, and critical mass was I was probably going to do something crazy, either suicide or close to, not understanding it, not realising it. And so I started on this path of counselling. Took a while to unburden myself because I still had that whole facade of, everything's fine. Spoke with her for a while, maybe a year. That helped me a lot. I was starting to reframe how I looked at the world. But I still had just no joy. I had nothing made me happy or brought me unbridled, natural, normal joy. My drinking was still out of control, all of that. So I went through this up and down, I guess, for a few years, and I finally got the right psych in 2019 and sat in front of her and told her my story. all of it. And then, in my joking manner, I said, "So, Doc, what do you reckon?" And she said, "Keith, you have chronic PTSD." She said, "Your resilience is amazing because other people would have crumpled in a heap long before today." And I went, wow. I'd learnt what PTSD was. I didn't think I'd been involved in enough dangerous stuff to warrant PTSD. I thought that was for soldiers who were in the middle of battle. Clearly not. Excuse me. And the next question was, "How does it make you feel?" And I said, I feel great because I now know I haven't been making this up or exaggerating it or imagining it. So that's been, the last 4 years, 5 years almost, of a path of recovery, which, has been awesome.
I'm so happy for you, man. I mean, I'm so sad hearing that. Generally, I've done fucking 300 odd of these podcasts. The first time I've cried on this show, but I'm so happy that you're able to talk about this and talk about this pain, and because it's important that people know, man. Like you, when I hear about all your stories, and I imagine your career, you are like, you're the superhero, you're the tough guy, and if this can happen to you, this can happen to anyone, man. So it's so important that you're able to do this. So I really do commend you for being able to recount these things. On top of the PTSD, on top of the survivor guilt, coming out of that career after being so immersed in it, and as you mentioned, this was your entire life. This was your purpose. This was your meaning.
Yeah.
Did you suffer with identity issues? Like, did you feel like you'd lost your identity?
Yeah, every day. I'd intended to be a lifelong cop, and I intended to, do my 40 years or whatever and retire as a cop, and and have some contribution to the world and all of that. So I went into the corporate world, and transitioning from a first responder or military into a corporate world is bloody tough, because for a long time, I didn't have any connection with people on a real level because they didn't get me, and I was I used to think I was arrogant about it, but it's a normal transition thing that a lot of people go through. Is, what the hell would these people know about the real world? Dickhead, 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 dickhead. Um, and and so I struggled with that a lot. And, I became a chameleon. I could sit in meetings, I could pretend to be one of the guys, but they had nothing in common at all. And I really badly missed my camaraderie, or the camaraderie of policing and my network. You form bonds that are impossible to describe unless you've been in them. When you are literally putting your life in someone else's hands. And all of that is tough to walk away from, but I had to walk away from it because I knew it was killing me. So that was the dichotomy. But yeah, I struggled with identity. I stopped telling people what my previous role was because we'd had a major corruption issue in the police around the time of the gun battle in '87, and even all those years later, people would look at me and go, why did you resign from the police force? Was there something that you did? And my response would be, man, I was involved in 4 shootings and I got blown up on Saturday afternoon. I was making like 40 grand. Why wouldn't I? Yeah. So I had this undercurrent of anger as well. How dare you challenge my integrity? In hindsight, probably just people being dicks, not intending any nasty, not having any nasty intent or malice, but just being dicks. But I couldn't, I had such anger, and it's another symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, is the anger. Wow. So I just operated on that level, doing my job, doing it effectively, but I just wouldn't put up with shit, and so as a result, in my corporate world, I moved from role to role about every 2 years. I'd get to a stage where I go, I can't cop this anymore. I'm going to find something else that hopefully I can fit into. So I was on a constant search to find camaraderie that was clearly missing from my life. All of that is apparent on reflection. At the time, I just thought, nah, I'll do something else.
On the topic of PTSD and people being misunderstood, this is the last story I'll ask you to recount, because anything else I encourage everyone to go and check out the book if they want to hear any more stories, because you've got so many of them. Yeah, you mentioned PTSD, and this is prevalent to the person involved in this, and this is in regards to one of your Valour Medals, your Valour Awards. So the story is that a man, he entered the MLC building in George Street, and he was armed with a rifle, hand grenades, TNT, and detonators.
Yeah.
How were you brought into this?
Which is what a lot of my friends asked me shortly after as well. What the hell were you doing there? I'd been running an undercover operation, so I'd been out to meet my undercover in the field, take the evidence, all of that stuff, do the paperwork, and give him support, etc. So coming back to the city in a very plain car, and I was dressed in jeans and a polo shirt. My hair was always longer than it should have been. And so again, deliberately cultivating the non-cop thing. And there was an any units in the vicinity of the MLC building, which was in the centre of Brisbane. So right in the heart of the CBD. I think it's about 31, 32 floors tall. So any unit, shots fired, male in the foyer of the building. Now, around that time, this was 93, 92. Yeah, 1992. So around that time, high-powered weapons were still available everywhere, as I said before. We'd had a number of gun massacres in Sydney. There'd been two. In Melbourne, there'd been two, where gunmen had just randomly shot at passing motorists, killed. So the Hoddle Street massacre, I think 11 people were killed. The Queen Street massacre in a telecommunications building in Melbourne, same thing, a gunman stormed it. So it had happened. So my natural immediate thought was, holy shit, we've got some guy who's just going to do the same thing. So I raced in there, parked the car, jumped out, took control, because I'd gone straight back into tactical mode. Got an inner cordon in place, told people to call for commissioned officers, negotiators, all that stuff. So I raced up the stairs with the intent of shooting this guy if I needed to. Unfortunately, I'd had some experience in that field before. So full on tactical mode, raced up, spoke to a uniformed sergeant and said, where is this guy? I think I might have used the term, where is this prick? And he indicated around the corner, and I sort of peeked around the corner into the foyer, weapon in hand, and saw him sitting on the floor with a rifle across his lap, a cardboard box, and army webbing that turned out to be Vietnam War era. And his first words to me were, and excuse the language, but put the gun down or I'll blow the whole fucking place up. So then I went, handed my gun to the uniform guy, which I vowed and declared I'd never do, but I did. Took a step in and then demanded to know who I was, showed him a badge, and then he said, why don't you come and talk to me? And for whatever reason, I have no idea why I did. That's exactly what I did. I walked up and started just talking with him. As I got closer, I saw in the box it turned out to be 15 sticks of gelignite, TNT, with 3 electronic detonators wired up to a 12-volt battery. All that was needed was to touch the terminal wires to the battery. The whole place would have gone up. And as I approached him, I said, so my name's Keith, what's your name? And it was Frank, and I said, so what's in the box, Frank? And he reached in and pulled out a half a stick and tossed it at me, and I caught it, and I'd been bomb trained. I'd been a bomb squad guy as part of my tactical world, and I recognised immediately it was what's called AN60 gelignite, and the nitroglycerin was sweating through the outer wrapper, which makes it completely unstable. If you drop it on the floor, it's likely to explode, so good thing I caught it. And then I thought, wow. So just started talking with this guy. And by that time, other resources, police resources had arrived. There were cordons, there were bosses, there were special weapons guys were outside, all of that stuff. And I said to him, let's have a chat about what's up. What's it going to take for me to get the rifle? Because you've clearly got enough to bring the building down. Why do you need a rifle? So he wanted a 6-pack of beer. I talked him down and went outside and said, look, this is completely against the rules. I know that. And I was never renowned for following the rules anyway. I had a little bit of a reputation. And I said, get him a pot of light beer. I'll take the rifle. And the inspector said, whoa, that's against the rules. I said, yeah, I know it is. But if it goes to shit, you can blame me. So in one of those ironies of life, the inspector at the scene was the same guy that I'd entered the bedroom with and killed the offender in 1987. So he knew how I operated. And he went, yep, okay, let's do it all. So walked back in with a beer full, and then I just started trying to negotiate the rest of the surrender. Not being a trained negotiator, probably a couple of things, having worked undercover and having an ability to immediately establish rapport with people, that helped. He told me that he had come back from the Vietnam War, and a classic story back in those days, marriage dissolved. They weren't really well received. A lot of Vietnam veterans had PTSD. And again, I didn't really know what PTSD was. It was still in the early 90s. He was clearly struggling. As we talked, his mood would go from maniacal to joking, threatened to kill me a few times, threatened to detonate the device. So we talked about how we could get him out. And what had happened was he'd gone into the building. It was an insurance building, or part of the floor was an insurance. Gone in to collect his superannuation, and the guy had laughed at him and said, if you withdraw it, you'll have to pay us a fee. He went home, drank, stewed, got angrier, dug up the gelignite that he'd had buried in his backyard, and God knows where he got it from, made the explosive device, loaded his rifle, got his webbing on, and rode his motorbike into town, and then just walked in and fired shots, and that's where he was when I turned up. But as we spoke, I asked him about how he was, how are you, mate? You look like you've got some issues. He was telling me things about his nightmares and his anger and his flashbacks and his drinking, and I'm thinking, fuck, I'm looking in a mirror. Wow, So we had that connection, I think, on that level. And I just kept saying to him, mate, you walk out with me, I'll make sure that the media gets a hold of this. And the best way to get revenge on this guy is not to blow this place up, you and me with it, is to get revenge that way. So finally got him to think about that. And as we were, a few things happened, as you probably know, and if people do read the chapter in the book, it was a bit funny from time to time. Amusing stuff happened. But at the end of it, when I thought I had him, he pulled a hand grenade out of the webbing and took the pin out. And I thought, oh, man. So, and that's when I said to him, listen, I've got enough nightmares already and I'm not going anywhere. Because he said, I'm going to detonate it, get out. And I would have had maybe 5 seconds to run away anyway, and the force of the explosion would have got me. So, I was stuffed. So I said, you're not going to be another one of my nightmares? Please put the pin back. And that's when I think he clicked. He thought, geez, this guy sort of gets it. And then put the pin back in the grenade, thankfully. Then we're talking away again. And one of the funny things is my pager went off, and my new partner had been shopping in the city, and I was supposed to pick her up after work. And he would go from cooperative to crazy, literally crazy in a heartbeat, and he just went off his head, tell him you're with me, don't. So I went, okay, that's cool. Can I check my pager message? And picked it up and read it, and I read it and went, I'm in trouble. And he said, what? And I said, it's my chick. I'm supposed to pick her up and I'm late. As you just do you say these crazy things when you're in a life-threatening situation, I guess. And he looked at me and said, oh, it's okay, mate. When you get home tonight, she'll understand why. And I thought, aha, gotcha.
Yeah.
So then I just knew that his mindset had changed to walking out. So I just had to persuade him that I'd be with him. He wasn't going to be rushed. He wasn't going to be handcuffed. He and I against the rest of the world, and that just made me realise that what I was struggling and suffering with maybe just wasn't me. Maybe there were other people out there who were going through the same stuff. So that was a bit eye-opening, but it was just about the connection. Thank God, and
in a weird way, it is a beautiful story in its own way. This has been an absolutely incredible and extremely thought-provoking conversation. I think I'm going to go away tonight. I mean, it's 10 o'clock now where I am. I think I'm going to lie in bed and think about some of these themes all night. The last question I want to ask you before we let these guys know where they can connect with you and find the book. This is a question that I ask everyone who comes on this podcast, no matter what they do, whether they're a military guy, an actor, a sportsman. I ask everyone the same question. And I suppose this is quite an interesting question based on the themes we've talked about today and where you were at one point. But the question is, right now, this second, for Keith Banks, what makes life worth living?
What makes life worth living is unequivocally my family, my friends, the joy that I now have in life again. Every day's a blessing, man. Every day is great. And also the fact that my book's being published and the networks that it's taken me into has enabled me to do this, to talk to people, either via podcast or media or in person or whatever, about the fact that if they're struggling, they're not alone. It's my passion now to drag the conversation of mental health out of the darkness into the light and make it normal. So all of that makes life worth living. And I'm, I often reflect on that horrible dark night where I nearly ended it all. And, thank God I didn't. Because in spite of everything, the world's a pretty good place.
Beautiful answer, man. And I'm glad you're there. Look, we've talked about a few stories today. There's so much more for people to check out. Drugs, Guns and Lies, Gun to the Head. Where can these guys go to find the book? And more importantly, to connect with you, any other work you may be doing, please let them know anywhere they can find you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So in the UK, Europe, Amazon is the best platform to buy the books. They're available in Kindle. They're also available in Audible. A good friend of mine is an Australian actor, did the reading for both books, and he's done a great job. He's a good guy. So, yeah, I think Amazon is the best. Certainly, it's, worldwide platform. People want to connect with me. My Instagram is Banksy, as in the graffiti artist that you guys have cultivated, Banksy175 on Insta. So, yeah, pretty easy to find. I do a lot of content on that. I'm also on LinkedIn. And, I just promote what I see are great causes for mental health, veteran support, first responder support. But also the wider conversation around mental health is that, everybody has some degree of trauma, everybody, during our lives. So, my platform, as I said before, is to really start that conversation and make it an authentic and genuine one. But yeah, would love for people to follow me. That'd be kind of cool. My daughters are already saying, "Dad, you've got more followers than some people I follow." So please follow me. Make my daughters impressed.
Well, I'll make sure all that's linked in the description below. Everyone can go and check that out. I'll also leave a link to some mental health resources following the conversations we've had today. Keith, I'll be honest, man, I've done 330 of these. This has to be up there as potentially one of my all-time favorites. So thank you so much for coming on today. It's been an absolute honor to speak with you, and I really appreciate your time, my friend.
Thank you, mate. That's very humbling, and I'm so rapt that you felt that it was appropriate to have a chat to me. So thank you for making the time.